make way for the next big thing, but this is mostly applicable to used gear. The good news is that solid-state components with no moving parts, like CPUs, rarely fail, and components with worn thermal compound or bad fans can have those repaired.
I nearly always start my builds around my CPU and GPU because, apart from being the most expensive components and therefore taking up most of my budget, they also dramatically narrow down the other parts that I might select. For example, I won't be able to buy an Intel chipset motherboard if I use an AMD CPU, and vice versa. And I won't be able to use a small form factor case if I've got a gigantic triple slot graphics card. When shopping for a CPU, there are a few things to keep in mind. First is that across brands, or even different generations of the same brand, specifications like clock frequency and cache are not likely to be useful indications of performance. You can find out more detail about this in this video. But that doesn't mean that you can ignore them outright. Let's say you've decided on a CPU series, but there are literally dozens of options. Obviously, choosing the best one is easy. Just sort by price high to low. But is it really that much faster? Is it worth it? Well, this is where the specs can help you make direct comparisons between multiple products in a single lineup. Take, for example, Intel's Core i9-11900K. This is an 8-core CPU with 16 threads that runs at up to 5.3 GHz. That's the turbo speed, of course. Its base frequency is just 3.5. Meanwhile, the Core i7-11700K is also an 8-core, 16-thread CPU that only runs at up to 5 GHz, meaning that the real-world performance between these two chips is 6% at most, but with a price difference of over $100.
There's more to picking a CPU than raw power, however. Sometimes you want integrated graphics, sometimes you want more or faster PCI Express lanes, and sometimes you just want less heat and noise. On the subject of PCI Express, or PCIe as it's commonly known, historically each new generation has doubled the per lane bandwidth of the previous one, making it a major selling point for shiny new platforms the world over. However, the importance of this for gamers and regular consumers alike can sometimes be overstated. Outside of raw file copy tests, PCI Express Gen 4 SSD will perform very similarly at Gen 3 speeds. However, again, recognizing this, manufacturers are beginning to build their newest generation add-in cards, like GPUs and SSDs, with fewer lanes to save on power and on cost. That means that a CPU with fewer but faster lanes can avoid bottlenecks that otherwise might harm performance. For example, as of writing, AMD's APUs can have as few as 10 PCI Express lanes available for use, only 4 of which are actually usable for a GPU. If a future APU upgraded those few lanes to PCI Express Gen 5 and you matched it with a Gen 5 GPU, that limitation becomes literally half as impactful. It's worth pointing out, by the way, that some motherboards and even some chipsets might differ in their PCI Express version support, even from one slot to the next. So pay close attention. If your first choices put you over budget, it's time to experiment and bargain hunt. For Intel users, an F-Series CPU might be a good option as those lack integrated graphics and cost a little less to buy. While for AMD users, paradoxically, buying the G-Series CPUs nets you integrated graphics and a decent savings over the more expensive X-Series without sacrificing much performance. If you end up going back a generation or two to make your budget work, be mindful of which CPU socket and motherboard chipset you end up with. Locking into something older might save you a ton of money and still result in satisfactory performance, but it could limit your ability to upgrade to a new processor later on. Other parts work in much the same way. When the GeForce RTX 2080 came out, its price was higher than the cost of a GTX 1080 Ti, while offering effectively zero performance advantage and a new headline feature that hadn't even been used in games yet, let alone proven. Savvy shoppers were scooping up 1080 Ti's for great prices left and right, and the only drawbacks ended up coming later, with more limited support for software features like RTX voice ambient noise cancellation and, in the longer term, probably an earlier driver support end date.
And I wish I could say things are better now, but the sad fact is that prices remain extortionate. The upper echelons of GPU performance today can cost more than twice what Nvidia charged for their GTX 1080 Ti in 2017, and that's adjusting for inflation. We live in dark times indeed, but there is a silver lining. Older GPUs still provide a lot of bang for the buck, especially now that GPU mining has cooled down. Secondhand GPUs are unlikely to come with any kind of warranty and might lack modern features like mesh shaders, real-time ray tracing, or AV1 encoding, but they're a great choice for traditional 1080p or 1440p gaming if you don't expect to run at max settings. Make sure you don't pick up the first shiny thing you see with a lot of megahertz.
As with CPUs, you must read reviews to evaluate the performance of a graphics card. Do not be tempted to draw a conclusion based on clock speeds and memory. Do look out, though, for features like hardware video encoding, real-time ray tracing support, and anything else that your game or your application might be able to use. Take, for example, DLSS, which increases performance at a small cost to visual fidelity, or the Blender Optics renderer for NVIDIA. And on the AMD side, there's the Fidelity FX suite, which has some pretty cool stuff in it as well. Now, if you have a choice between two otherwise identical GPUs, but with different amounts of onboard memory, or frame buffer, I would recommend the one that has more. But be careful that it's not slower memory. Both AMD and NVIDIA have been caught putting large amounts of crummy memory on entry-level GPUs, sometimes even mid-range GPUs, seemingly in an attempt to make them look more enticing, even if it comes at the cost of extremely poor performance.
Your PC isn't the only thing your GPU plugs into, and as a display owner myself, I own a display. I know a thing or two about plugging in displays. When buying a GPU or monitor, pay close attention to the ports available on the I/O plate here. Most GPUs today come with a bank of DisplayPort connectors and an HDMI port. And while you might be forgiven for thinking they're the same, they are very much not. While they share some similarities, they're both digital, they both carry audio as well as video, and, as of writing, the latest versions of both support features like variable refresh rate and HDR. HDMI connectors are shaped like a very tall D, while DisplayPort looks like you folded the corner of a rectangle. Also, while HDMI doesn't normally lock, most DisplayPort cables will automatically click into place with these little teeth, which hold it firm until you push the release. Some graphics cards will also support more bandwidth over DisplayPort than HDMI, and some displays will only support certain features, refresh rates, or even resolutions on one type of connection. The bottom line is, make sure you're using an interface and cable that are rated for sufficient bandwidth. Matching the version numbers isn't enough. A quick note, if you're short on HDMI ports but you see this logo or dual mode DisplayPort, it means your port can convert directly to HDMI with a cheap passive adapter.
One more thing, some GPUs have USB Type-C ports, but you can't connect it to just any display. Both the port and the monitor will need to support DisplayPort Alt Mode, which is an optional part of the specification. The big draw to Alt Mode is that it can also be combined with normal USB data and even power in a single cable. Thunderbolt, aka USB 4.0, goes a step further and guarantees Alt Mode and power delivery will be available, and even allows for daisy chaining multiple displays or devices without needing a hub. While there are pros and cons to all of these connections, which one you ultimately use should be whichever one gives you the features you need and is compatible with your hardware.
Motherboards are a contentious issue because it's easy to go for the biggest, baddest board around, but the reality is that unless you're the kind of master overclocker who gets all their boards sponsored anyway, you're unlikely to see a big performance difference between low-end chipsets and the higher-end ones, much less between two models that use the same chipset. That's not to say you should just buy the cheapest thing. A lower-end chipset will usually have some artificial limitations on things like RAM speed, overclocking ability, or PCIe bandwidth. AMD's A-series chipsets, for example, don't support overclocking as of A520 and feature fewer expansion ports, while their B-series and X-series chipsets do have much more expansion, including the ability to bifurcate or split PCIe lanes for multi-GPU or high-speed storage support. The bottom line is that while some people get bogged down on details like voltage regulators and cooling them, the reality is that a mid-range board with good user reviews that has all the slots, sockets, and RGB ports you need for other hardware is the path of least resistance, and there's no shame in that.
System memory, or RAM, can be both straightforward and incredibly deep depending on who you ask and what you plan to do with it. It's usually labeled according to three main values: capacity, speed, and timings. The higher the capacity, the more concurrent tasks your system can work on, but the more memory you have, the more strain on your CPU's memory controller, which usually means reduced frequency and increased timings, both of which are bad. Frequency determines how often information can travel from the memory stick or module to the CPU and vice versa. Higher is better, while timings determine how long the wait is for actual memory chips to respond to a given request. Lower is better. It's important to note that there are points of diminishing returns for all of these attributes, and that some CPUs prefer certain memory frequencies because they can lock their memory controllers to match, such as AMD's Ryzen 3000 and 5000 series CPUs, which tend to work best at memory speeds of 3600 or 3800 megatransfers per second DDR4, after which point it's better to drive down latencies than go for more speed. And it should be noted, most of the fast kits on the market are overclocked, meaning both the memory modules and the CPU's memory controller will be pushed harder and with more voltage than usual. DDR4 capable platforms like Ryzen 5000 and Intel's 14th Gen Core CPUs, for example, only officially support up to 3200 megatransfers per second DDR4, which means reaching the speeds of a top-spec memory kit is anything but guaranteed, especially if you've got more than 2 sticks of RAM. Ryzen 5000 and Intel's 11th Gen Core and later CPUs support up to 3200 megatransfers per second DDR4 natively, after which you're in overclock territory. Regardless of speed, you'll want to buy your memory in matching pairs for dual-channel motherboards, triplets for triple channel, and so on. And while you're at it, for best performance, you'll want to make sure your memory is also running dual rank. Now, rank is essentially one or more memory modules that receive commands as a group. If all of the memory stick's memory is in one group, that's single rank, while some larger memory modules come split into two, which is dual rank. The advantage is that while each rank has to be accessed separately, no matter what, they can still split the load between themselves for better performance. If you've got a matched pair of dual rank memory, you'll get the benefits by default. But you can also install 4 matched single rank modules for the same effect if your motherboard has 4 slots. Generally speaking, larger modules tend to be dual rank, but you can usually tell single rank and dual rank apart by 1R or 2R in the model number.
One more thing to consider for memory is error correction code, or ECC memory. This has recently become a pretty hot topic due to the per-chip error correction that's making its way into DDR5. But there's a difference. Full ECC memory has an extra chip that allows it to detect and correct errors even when the data is moving to and from the CPU. DDR5's error correction is only making sure that the data inside each chip is safe. This lets DDR5 vendors still offer overclocked memory kits, while you'd be hard-pressed to find anything like that for full ECC. The more robust nature of full ECC memory, meanwhile, has made it a favorite for servers and high-end workstations where stability is key, even if it comes at the cost of some performance. So if that's you, then you've got some things to untangle first. True ECC can come in 3 flavors: unregistered, registered, and load reduced. Unregistered memory, also called UDIMM, is the same kind that goes into your desktop and notebook PC, so your CPU will access the memory chips directly with nothing in between. Registered memory, also called RDIMM, includes a go-between chip that the CPU talks to that manages the data coming and going from each memory chip. Load-reduced memory, called LRDIMM, takes this one step further by replacing that register chip with an ultra-fast buffer. This buffer reduces the amount of chatter required to communicate with the memory, allowing the CPU to access as many as 8 ranks per module. That's how servers can have multiple terabytes of memory in them. The trade-off, of course, is higher latency. Don't go thinking you can just mix and match, by the way. Consumer motherboards almost exclusively accept UDIMMs and not much else. And while some motherboards can support both RDIMMs and LRDIMMs, this is no guarantee. So check the manual for your motherboard for information on what it can handle before you pull the trigger. Most motherboard manufacturers will have manuals available online in their support section.
Storage drives can be divided broadly into 2 categories: old school SATA and PCI Express-based NVMe drives. There are different connections for both of these, with this being the most common for SATA and this being the most common for NVMe. Your motherboard manual will include a list of these ports that tells you exactly how many you can install. Mechanical hard drives are for bulk storage on the cheap and typically use a SATA interface. We'll talk a bit more about these later. Solid state drives, or SSDs, are more expensive but are recommended as a boot drive for your operating system and for key applications at almost any price point due to their much higher performance. They are available with SATA interfaces but have mostly gone NVMe at this point in the M.2 form factor. Remember that term? It means size and shape. Even among NVMe SSDs, there is an obvious broad performance spectrum, and with Microsoft's upcoming implementation of direct storage, a premium PCIe Gen 4 SSD or greater might offer a clear performance benefit. But for most average users and gamers, the main things you want are a DRAM cache and some kind of manufacturer indication of endurance, which is a measure of how many times the drives can be written before the cells wear out. Drives with short warranties are probably best avoided, and even quality drives should be backed up regularly.
Now let's talk cooling. Enthusiasts tend to instinctively gravitate towards custom loop liquid cooling, and this is usually the absolute best you can get with outgoing Sub-Zero, which isn't sustainable long term, if you're a coward. But from a cost to performance standpoint, it rarely makes sense. Liquid cooling is a topic all in itself, but the short version is that your primary concerns are going to be the water blocks and the total surface area of your radiator setup. Generally speaking, surface area is king. More fins on your cold plate means more heat transfer from your CPU, and more radiator surface area means the more heat you can remove from your liquid, or if you like more silence, the slower you can run your many fans. Materials are less intuitive though. Copper is the superior conductor, but it's more expensive than aluminum, which might make you think you could get away with copper for your GPU and aluminum for everything else, but if you try to mix and match them, it's gonna be terrible. I give you my Linus Tech Tips guarantee that galvanic corrosion will ruin your day sometime down the line. You can try out those anti-corrosion mixtures, don't do it, it'll be really bad. Some metals can be mixed relatively safely. Here's a chart of what's safe to mix and what's not. Most people don't want to deal with all that, though all-in-one solutions are both cheaper and easier to work with. The general rule is that a 240mm radiator is fine for most CPUs, but top-end CPUs with power ratings over 200 watts will want a beefier 360mm or 280mm radiator for full performance, or even more.
Oh god, it's so big.
The main drawbacks of AIOs is that they are more expensive, less reliable, and units smaller than 360mm often have questionable performance benefits compared to larger tower-style heatsinks. That's why, for most people, we recommend a large heatsink for hassle-free long-term operation. The only drawback of these is that due to their size, some consider them unsightly, they're wrong, and they can be a hazard during transportation due to their immense weight. At the end of the day, whatever comes of your CPU is fine for most people, but it might run hotter or louder than you want. Thermal compound for most people doesn't matter, as long as it's a decent brand and it's not some just bulk stuff you got off of Wish. But there are a couple things to consider. If you're not going with the easy to use but not thermally amazing graphite pads that cover your CPU like a cozy little blanket, you're going to want to make sure that whatever you get is electrically non-conductive, and the best way to do that is to just look at the label. Most companies exclusively carry non-conductive compounds, with the exception being liquid metal. Thermal Grizzly's Conductonaut, for example, is an actual metal alloy called Galinstan that's fully liquid at temperatures as low as 8 degrees Celsius. It's both electrically conductive and potentially reactive with aluminum parts like heat sinks, and this reaction is not a good thing. While an aluminum oxide layer is usually present on aluminum, a tiny scratch or scuff is all that's needed for the gallium to work its magic and turn your cooler into a crumbly mess that doesn't even look real. If you decide to try liquid metal, make sure you're using copper or nickel-plated coolers. If you're content with cheaper traditional compounds, then you've got nothing to fear.
There are some things you just shouldn't cheap out on, however. Power supplies are a major one. While early on, it was pretty easy to figure out whether a power supply was decent by just looking at its 80+ rating. And it is 80+ gold. That is the real draw for this power supply series right there. It is so easy to hit the 80+ standards these days that it's not really a useful measure anymore. The good news is Cybernetics Lab has stepped up to build a more meaningful certification system that addresses both efficiency and noise levels, and hopefully more in the future. Beyond that, the main feature you need to decide if you need is a modular interface. Those usually cost more, but as connectivity standards evolve, like the controversial ATX 12-volt high power connector, it means that you have a chance of simply swapping a cable rather than being forced to use an adapter or even replace a perfectly functional power supply. Power supplies have kind of plateaued these days to the point where no matter what I'm building, I would expect 5 or even 10 years of trouble-free service, which means that I'm expecting it to power more than one build.
Seasonic's Vertex series of power supplies have stepped up the game in terms of build quality. Their Vertex GX750 is fully modular, and they've added a new cable to help with GPU compatibility. The fans on these bad boys stay quiet without any compromises to your system's temperature, and they've upped their warranty to 12 years, so go check them out. There's a link down there, click it.
Whatever connectors you're using though, I would advise you to avoid unnecessary cosmetic adapters on your high power connectors. They might improve at some point, but I'm pretty tired of hearing stories about these things melting. Power supplies, like motherboards and cases, have different form factors that you need to look out for though. This consideration is mostly important for small form factor builds, where the SFX standard provides a smaller footprint in order to accommodate tinier builds. While SFX defines a maximum depth for a power supply that sort of makes it look like a flat rectangle, SFXL relaxes this to a square shape. And while it doesn't necessarily offer more connections, you'll actually find that usually the more powerful small form factor units are SFXL, and they have the added benefit of using larger fans, so they tend to be a little bit quieter. Just double check your case's compatibility, because not all cases that support one can also support the other. Another class of power supplies that has grown in popularity over the last 10 years is DC to DC converter power supplies. These use an external brick, just like some monitors or your laptop, and then have a super efficient DC to DC conversion, hence the name, that takes whatever the input voltage is and splits it out to all the voltages that you need internally. They tend to be fanless and extremely small, though it does come at the cost of that external brick. Now, there are other esoteric form factors, like TFX, that is often used in rack mount servers, but for nearly everything else, you'll be fine with an ATX form factor power supply. It's big, it's chunky, and it's the standard that we've had since not long after the Windows 95 days. These offer the highest wattages on the market, with the largest assortment of peripheral and 12-volt plugs for CPU and PCI Express devices and drives and all that good stuff. But buyer beware. The ATX form factor only specifies the width and height of the power supply at the backplate. It says nothing about the depth, so you will need to take into consideration whether your power supply will fit your chosen case if it's not in the typical square footprint. And make sure you buffer a little extra if you have a modular interface, because those plugs take up a little bit more space.
Now, cases. This is where builds can get very interesting. There are options that can be found for as low as $20 on sale, and there are options costing well over 10 times that much. Or 100 times. Who cares? Just keep going if you want something truly unique. We've already gone over the different major form factors, but even within these constraints, there is an incredible amount of variety out there. Because picking a case on its own is so personalized and situational, we're just going to go over a few basic things to keep in mind while picking one out. First and foremost is airflow. Regardless of whether you're after a quiet rig or an extreme cooling rig, you're going to need airflow, and there's no substitute for a mesh front panel. Counterintuitively, they tend to even offer better acoustic performance than closed front panel cases because the fans don't need to ramp up as high. Not everyone is into that aesthetic though, so vendors like Corsair have come up with options with glass front panels instead, with spacing and even extra intakes on the motherboard side panel to keep things looking pretty while maintaining solid airflow. Secondary to airflow should be ease of maintenance. If your case has great airflow, but it's a pain to clean once it's sucked a bit of dust in, you're gonna have a bad time. Removable dust filters and easily accessible front panels help tremendously with maintenance, and most good cases will come with these features. Finally, expansion. What you get will depend on how much of what kind of stuff you want to cram in, plain and simple. Then beyond that, it should ideally be well laid out for cable management and open enough that it's easy to work in.
Of course, you won't have any cooling without fans, so what do you buy? There are several considerations here, including the fan's diameter and bearing type, whether the blade is optimized for airflow or static pressure, and of course, whether or not it has addressable RGB. Bearings are what let the fan blade spin freely, so the better quality of the bearing, the more efficient and less noisy a fan can be, and there are three major types. Sleeve bearings are cost-effective and quiet, but tend to wear out quickly because they rely on a lubricant to keep them going. Higher quality sleeve bearing fans can last for years thanks to better seals, but that lubricant will expire, and once it does, so does the fan. Sleeve bearing fans are also designed to run vertically to prevent the lubricant from pooling, making them unsuitable for use in the top or bottom of cases. Ball bearing fans are far more reliable and much more expensive to match, but they tend to be louder because they utilize actual physical ball bearings to overcome friction instead of a lubricant. This also means they're much more likely to survive high temperatures than a sleeve fan, so they're common in servers and other reliability-first environments. More advanced sleeve style bearings, called fluid dynamic or hydrodynamic bearings, are positioned as a bridging gap between traditional sleeve and ball bearing fans. While their mechanisms are similar to sleeve bearings, they're typically filled with pressurized oil and higher quality seals than a regular lubricating grease. Not all fans that use these bearings are good, but Noctua, for example, exclusively uses their SSO series bearings, which are hydrodynamic and very well regarded. I think Corsairs are also pretty good too. There are other bearings like Maglev, which use magnetic levitation for effectively zero friction and are thus extremely quiet, long-lasting, and they also cost significantly more than other types of bearings. Corsair famously has a Maglev series of fans in their ML lineup, but they tend to have fewer RGB options and cost significantly more than their other fans. Regardless of the bearings, fans tend to get graded on two major criteria: static pressure and airflow, with some designs leaning further one way than the other. Corsair's SP and Noctua's P series fans are optimized for static pressure. The higher the static pressure, the more air that can be forced through a restrictive filter or fins of a radiator or heatsink. On the other side of the spectrum, Corsair's AF and Noctua's A series are examples of fans that are optimized for pure airflow. So don't put it in front of your radiator, but at like the back of your case with no obstructions. They're really great for that.
You'll often run across different diameters of fans, ranging all the way from diminutive 40mm all the way to behemoth 200mm and beyond. As a rule of thumb, the smaller the fan, the faster it needs to spin to push the same amount of air as a larger one. And the faster a fan spins, the louder it will be, which is why 120 to 140mm fans have become the go-to, thanks to the amount of air that they can push while being relatively quiet. 80 and 92mm used to be commonplace in older computer cases, and you can still find mounts for these in some small form factor rigs and on smaller air coolers like Noctua's U9S. Thickness is another thing that can vary, and again, the thinner the fan, the less air it can push at a given noise level. A full-sized 92mm fan, for example, will actually push more air with more pressure than a 120mm slim fan. You'll only really want to use thin fans for small form factor builds where you have absolutely no alternative. Then there's the connectors. Some fans have 3 pins on them, and some of them have 4. What gives with that? Well, practically speaking, they both work the same, but the 3-pin variant's speed is controlled by changing the voltage being delivered to the motor. The 4-pin variants, on the other hand, use a control scheme called PWM, which means that the motor exclusively receives 12-volt power, but it gets it in bursts, so it's rapidly turned on and off depending on the speed that is requested by the user. In short, PWM fans tend to be more efficient and offer finer control over their rotational speeds. But it's more important to match your fan type with your controller than to choose one over the other. Most of your fans are going to be plugged directly into your motherboard, but if you have a truly ridiculous number of fans, or you just want to control and cable manage them all from one place, you can get controller hubs from companies like Corsair or NZXT that provide significantly more connectors to suit your needs.
And depending on your needs, you might want to add one or more hard drives to your system, either for long-term storage or maybe to give storage tiering a go for a blend of high performance and low cost. Whatever the reason, there are some things you should be aware of, like the RPM, cache size, noise level, and cost per gigabyte or terabyte. It used to be common to just pick a 7200 RPM drive no matter what for extra speed and lower response time, but it's actually becoming more of a liability for the drive's long-term health now that high-capacity SSDs exist. Higher RPMs mean more noise, and critically, more heat. So before committing to a high-speed hard drive, you should consider whether it's needed at all. And when you do install one, be aware of its operating temperature so that the platter stays spinning for as long as possible. For everybody else, a 5600 or 5900 RPM hard drive should suffice and should be significantly quieter and kick out less heat.
Finally, if you want to really class up your build, you're probably going to want RGB, and that means you're going to need to learn what to look for. Currently, there are 3 major types of controllable RGB: non-addressable, addressable, and USB. Non-addressable is inexpensive and is the original RGB header that uses 12-volt power and 4 pins. Each device in the chain, be it a light strip or a fan, plugs into the header on a motherboard, a splitter, or into another RGB device in a daisy chain. Every LED in this chain will show the same color of your choosing, which is fine for ambient lighting or for when you don't really care about patterns and animations, but if you do care about those, Addressable is your new best friend, because like its name suggests, it allows each individual LED in the chain to be controlled independently. It typically uses a 5-volt, 3-pin header that's the same physical size as the non-addressable type, with the pin blocked off to differentiate it. If you have a lot of LED strips, you should be aware that only a limited number of strips can be run off a single connector without running into problems like dimming at the ends or the inability to control all the LEDs. If this all sounds complicated, well, it kind of is. That's why some companies, like Corsair, have devices that use their own method via USB. This lets them know exactly what devices are connected and how many LEDs each of them has. These will usually plug into a USB header on your motherboard and can be more complex to wire up, but often are much simpler to set up, usually using proprietary software. Now, there are packages for universal RGB control, like Signal RGB, Open RGB, and even a function built into Windows 11. But compatibility can be spotty, and the interface may not be as elegant as the official software. Or it could be significantly better. So your mileage will definitely vary. This vendor lock-in means that unlike non-USB options, they're usually not cross-compatible between brands, so you'll probably end up choosing your favorite and then using the same vendor for all your other RGB, unless you want to deal with adapters. This especially sucks because some companies offer LED strips with different styles that might be more in line with what you're going for visually, like Phanteks digital RGB neon strips.
Finally, you'll probably want some cable ties and to make sure that you have the tools you need to set everything up. If you go for zip ties for a lower profile cable management job, you'll need to make sure that you have flush cutters for the cleanest look. Whereas if you go for hook and loop ties, like the ones you can find on lttstore.com, then you don't need anything special. You should consider though whether optional stuff like custom cables will be in your build at this point. They're pretty costly, but they're a cool way to jazz up your rig if you've got the cash to spare and you're after a specific look. If not though, don't sweat it. Not everybody is out to build an art piece, and there is no performance benefit to them whatsoever. And besides, building a PC yourself is already a bigger step towards making it yours than most people will ever take. Once you've settled on a build, you can go ahead and click through the checkout process and wait for the parts to arrive. Or, if you live near a computer store with all the stuff that you need, lucky you get to haul it all home yourself. Assemble the boxes in a photogenic pile for a quick social media pic, and finally, you're ready to begin. Step 2, setting up your work area. Are we only on step 2? Jeez. All right. Don't worry, guys. The hard part's over. Things are going to go a little faster now. Clear your desk or table. You're going to want a well-lit area with enough space to be able to easily move around your case, whether it's laid flat or upright, and grab any tools you'll need. A Phillips head screwdriver is a must, and if it's got a long neck, a magnetic tip, and a ratcheting mechanism, that'll make things a lot easier. 1 or 2 coffee filters and some 99% isopropyl alcohol is optional, but useful for cleaning surfaces without leaving behind any residue. Paper towels can also work in a pinch, but be careful not to leave behind any bits. And for when you're finishing up, another optional item is a microfiber cloth to get rid of all the greasy fingerprints that you might leave behind. Less optional is a flashlight of some sort, even if it's just the flash on your phone, since it can otherwise be tough to see what you're doing when you're trying to get that one last wire installed after everything else is in place. Now, completely set aside any food or drink while you're building up your machine. This is build time, not snack time, and make sure there's nothing around that could fall if it's accidentally bumped. An anti-static mat or a desk pad is ideal here to prevent scuffs and scrapes not only on your desk, but also on your new machine. Now this next bit is a bit contentious, but if the air in your area is dry, then you will definitely want an anti-static wrist strap. We did show that it takes a lot to outright destroy PC components in this collab with Electroboom, but what we don't know is what kind of minor damage might have been done internally with each of those zaps. It is possible that each one of them took a year off of our victim's life. And no, by the way, wireless anti-static wrist straps do not work. Your strap needs to be connected to a proper ground, and the same goes for an anti-static mat. That's what that connector on the end is for. To do that, the most foolproof way that works in any country is to plug your power supply into mains power and clip your anti-static lead to its chassis. Just make sure you're not using one of these. Never use one of these unless you know exactly how to use one, because if you're not actually grounded, you